everyone. So before we get started today, are there any questions from any of you that are logged on about the course going forward or any of those logistics? Okay, looks like there are no questions. So let's go ahead and get started today with language variation. So quick outline for what we'll be talking about today is first hold on, one question. If we decide not to take the final exam, will we need to submit the review questions still? Yes, so the review questions are totally separate from the final exam, or not review questions, sorry. The review question is a part of quiz 5 now. So usually your quizzes are worth 12 points, but we kind of wrapped that final review question into your quiz, and that's why it's worth 16 points. So there'll be no final review question to submit, and there'll be no final review session. Instead, we'll just be available for office hours if you guys have questions, since the format is a little different. No problem. Okay, so going into the outline, today we'll talk a little bit about what language variation actually is, and then we'll talk about the field of sociolinguistics, and within that we'll look at linguistic variation and social variation. And then we'll kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about this really, big debate in the field about what came first, language or thought. So it's kind of that like chicken and the egg problem. Which one of those came first? And within that, we'll go into some detail about linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. So starting with what is language variation? Language variation refers to the way in which languages vary from one another. So pretty self-explanatory, but we can look at that in a lot of detail, as you guys can probably imagine. So one way that we can look at language variation, and one way we kind of have in some sense, is just look at differences across different languages. So these like large scale differences between phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics. So we can look at how English is a subject verb object language, whereas a language like Japanese has a different word order. So we can look at those large scale language variation differences, but we can also look at it within a single language. So generally when we talk about language variation within a language, we're looking at one aspect known as dialect. So dialect is a form of language that's distinguished by those subcomponent features. So features like phonology, lexicon, morphology, and syntax, but it's within a person's language or within speech communities. And it tends to be particular to a region or a social group or even one particular individual. So when we look at dialect, we can actually break that down even further. We're really about like layering and subcomponent pieces in linguistics. So when we look at dialect, we can talk about accents. And typically accents are just the result of phonological variation. And that phonological variation is very strongly linked to morphological and syntactic variation. So what that means is if you are a speaker of another language and you come in and you learn English, then perhaps when you're like maybe adding a plural morpheme S to the end of a word, we know that in English that S sound can come out in different ways. So It can be a s, a z, like a z sound, or an uz. And so depending on your accent, that might vary more within you because you don't have that distinction in your language. So a lot of times phonological variation is really strongly tied to morphology and syntax when we're talking about accents. We can also look at dialects in terms of sociolects. So sociolects are language varieties just used by the speech community itself. And then we can look at an idiolect, which is the dialect of an individual speaker. And we'll focus a lot more in later slides on sociolect, because this is kind of the bigger thing within sociolinguistics. We can also look at different speech styles. So speech styles are just systematic variations in speech based on factors such as the topic of speech, the setting that you're in, and the people that you're talking to. And within speech styles, we can talk about register. So this is one of the reasons that your speech styles will often change. And that's because within register, we have different levels of speech formality that we can use depending on the situation. And English doesn't have any kind of like morpheme marking system to indicate different levels of formality, but other languages do. So in some languages, if you're addressing an older adult, then you have to use a different form of like an article or different morphemes on a noun, things like that. And when we talk about register, we can also talk about style shifting, where you're really, that's just changing between different registers. So that could be going from talking to a professor with formal speech and then leaving the classroom and switching to more informal speech with your friends. And it can also be switching between things like jargon and slang. So if I am talking to my lab mate Carrie, I might use more jargon and I might also use more slang. But if I go and talk to my advisor, I'd probably cut back on the slang and just keep my speech a little more formal. So there's a question in here that says, is this similar to code switching? For code switching, I think you're talking about for style shifting or for register. That's a little bit different. Code shifting or with register, it's really just about the level of formality. With code switching, you can still switch depending on the level of formality. So you can still talk to a professor and code switch, whereas you might be talking to a friend and also code switch in the same way. But good thinking with that. So moving on to what sociolinguistics actually is, I think, with the prefix socio, it's kind of clear, but you guys have probably heard a lot about sociolinguistics and may have not had a chance to really dive into that field. So we'll look at what this field really investigates. So sociolinguistics is the study of interrelationships between language and society. And it really came about with this intersection of other fields. So there were a lot of fields like anthropology, sociology, and social psychology that were interested in how people use language, and so how they facilitate those social dynamics, they facilitate culture, it facilitates a person's well-being. And so that intersection of those interests came about and formed the field of sociolinguistics. And we've been talking about psycholinguistics for a while, so you know that this linguistics is really not just one field. There's a lot of parts and a lot of ways to look at it. Both Carrie and I look at linguistics from more of a neurological perspective. So yeah, that's how sociolinguistics came about. And it includes social variables and linguistic variables, and looks to understand the relationship between those variables and how those variables interact. So we'll go ahead and look now at what I'm talking about when I say linguistic variation and social variation. So we'll start with linguistic variation. And linguistic variation is just about internal variation within a person or within a language that exists at all of those different linguistic levels. So at the phonetic, the phonological level, the morphological level. And you can see at each of these levels that the way in which people use these features to like kind of differentiate themselves and differentiate their language and have different dialects is pretty interesting stuff. So looking at linguistic variation with phonetics and phonology, I'm just going to go through some examples of what this might look like. And your book actually does a really nice job of putting like a ton of examples in there. So I'll just elaborate a little bit on these examples. So when we talk about phonetic variation, typically we see that across when we're talking about like different registers of speech. So again, that register is looking at the different levels of speech formality. So one example, and this one is actually in your textbook, is with American Sign Language. When they say the word no informally, the fingers actually touch the cheekbone, whereas in more formal settings, the fingers actually touch the temples. So depending on the speech register that you're in, you will actually change that position of your hand, and that's a phonetic feature in ASL. Another example for those who don't sign is this one's just personal. I remember my brother was doing some interview, and whenever he says yes, he always says yeah, like yeah. And I remember my mom suggesting that since it's a little more formal, he should probably use yes, like the full S on the end. So those are ways in which, depending on the formality of the situation, our phonetic features might vary. Looking at that in terms of phonology, that just has to do with how sound systems vary. So one common example of this is with West Coast English compared to Boston English. So on the West Coast, we probably say something like park the car. But in Boston, if you want to have that like real quintessential Boston accent, then you'd probably say something like park the car. And that's people that use Boston English, they do that because their dialect is a non-rhotic dialect. And what that means is that when they have words that have a vowel, then an R sound, and then a consonant, so like park, what they do is they actually will drop that R sound because they don't allow that combination in their dialect. And that's where you get that pak. Similarly, with the word like car, when you have a vowel, an R sound, and then the end of a word boundary, they also don't allow that. So that's why you have ka. And you have it sound like that because, as you guys have probably learned from your other classes, that R kind of really colors that vowel sound. So you get that real Boston accent, the pak the ka. And that has to do with phonological variation. Another example of this is what's known as the Great California Vowel Shift. And that's where a lot of vowels in Californian English were fronted. They're farther forward in the mouth and lowered. So you get that real U sound, an A sound. And that's also subject to a lot of jokes on our behalf. So if any of you guys are familiar with the Californians, that SNL skit, they really take advantage of this California vowel shift by fronting their vowels a lot and really over exaggerating that. And then they also talk about the freeway a lot because, Californians always like talking about how they're going to get places. So definitely the subject of a lot of jokes, but a good example of phonetic and phonological variation that kind of gives us that California dialect. All right, so moving on to morphology. So linguistic variation with morphology are things like not using the correct morphemes with, I don't want to say correct, using different morphemes with verbs. So that's why in some dialects you can have things like I are, I is, you are, you is. And once again, always subject to creating really great memes for the class. So chicks be like, hair tied, chilling with no makeup on. I really relate to this meme right now with quarantine, so thought I'd throw that in. But you also get things like I be drowning or I be doing, those kind of formations where it's following the syntactic structure, but the morpheme that's in there is wrong. Or not wrong, it's just different. I keep having to correct myself on that. One big thing with sociolinguistics is the way in which you use language is not wrong. That's how you use it to convey language. But I'll keep catching myself. Okay, so moving to linguistic variation with syntax. So we can see variation in how words are combined. So in SAE, which is Standard American English, we can say things like, I might be able to do that. But with Southern English, something like I might could do that is actually perfectly grammatical and perfectly acceptable for their dialect. And the reason is that you guys learned from your syntactic structure rules that you can only ever have one auxiliary verb, but in Southern English, they can actually have two auxiliary verbs right next to each other. So another similar example would be maybe I should do that in Standard American English. In Southern English, this would look at like I might should do that. In addition, for Standard American English, verbs like need and want are usually followed by to be, so the like non-conjugated version of be, the infinitive form of be. And so that's why we see things like the dog needs to be walked or the dog wants to be fed. But in some Midwestern dialects, these verbs are followed instead just by the past tense version of the verb. So they don't need that to be there. So that would look like the dog needs walked or the dog wants fed. And that's perfectly acceptable in the language. For me, that doesn't actually sound too bad. I wouldn't, bat a lash too much at that, but I would definitely sway more towards these structures with to be followed after need and want. Okay. So the last level here is linguistic variation at the semantic or the lexical level. So with this, we often see a lot more regional variation in what certain things are called. So for example, when you guys see this here, what do you all call this image on the screen? What is your word for that? Okay. You guys all sound like West Coasters. Yeah, so most of you are saying soda, but there's a lot of regional variation in this. And if you ever take those like funny BuzzFeed quizzes where it's like, we can predict where you're from, this is usually one thing that will pop up is they're like, what do you call this? Because that varies a lot by region. So in the Midwest, it's often called pop, or some people use the generic brand name like a Coke or a Pepsi for it, and other people just call it soda. That's more common on the West Coast. I saw somewhere they call it fizzy. I don't know where that is, but somewhere they do that. So other examples of this are there's a lot of these from British and American English, where phrases mean different things. So in British English, to be pissed means to be drunk, whereas in American English, to be pissed means usually like you're mad. And I think if you're, trying to instill more British culture in your life, then you might use it like that. But otherwise, we kind of have this distinction in American English. Another example is for British English, the word trolley actually refers to a shopping cart, whereas in American English, trolley would most likely be a train or some kind of like transportation. And then we can also vary our linguistic or semantic level here based on register. That's really just like a stylistic variation. So if you're talking to someone in a formal setting, you may say like, the young man fell. I don't know what formal setting you're talking about someone falling, but you'd be more likely to say the young man fell. Whereas in an informal setting, if you're just with your friends or whomever, you'll probably say like, yeah, that dude fell. So we also get a lot of lexical variation depending on the register. So any questions about linguist? Oh, I forgot I had this in here. This is just funny. I saw this, I think probably a couple of years ago, but I just really, really relate to it. Where for Californians, no, yeah equals yes. Yeah, no is no. Yeah, no, for sure means definitely. No, yeah, no means, oh, no, no, you're fine. And yeah, no, yeah means, I'm sorry, but unfortunately the answer is yes. So if you ever have anyone that comes from like, the East Coast, Midwest, or some other country, maybe give them this cheat sheet for Californian English for how to understand our lexical levels. Okay, so going into social variation. Social variation will mostly focus on social dialects. And again, social dialects are just varieties of language used by different groups, so by those sociolects. And generally, they're defined according to these different parameters. So things like social class, education, age, gender, race, ethnicity, things like that. So when we talk about social variation, one of the main things that is talked about is this idea of prestige. So with prestige, you can have both overt and covert prestige. So overt prestige just has to do with language that's generally recognized as better or is more like positively valued by your broader, wider speaking community. Whereas covert prestige is language that has kind of like this hidden positive social value that it may not have to do with standard English forms or standard dialectal forms, but it puts you within a subgroup of individuals that use that. So it's really how you identify with your speech community is covert prestige, whereas overt prestige has to do with like fitting into that larger community. And one way whenever I see this movie, it kind of reminds me of this concept. So if any of you have seen Good Will Hunting, I think the Boston dialect has influenced my thinking. But you know that when the guys, they're all just hanging out, they have this real like tough way of talking, and they, lots of cursing, and their covert way of marking their group and their identity. So when Ben Affleck goes into this Harvard bar, he's like, "Oh, this is a Harvard bar, huh?" And then he's like, "I thought there'd be like equations and shit on the wall." So kind of like mocking that more prestigious way of speaking. And then within the same scene, they get into an argument with this guy who seems like he really identifies with having like a high level of speech and sounding more educated, and he ends up kind of being put down, not kind of, he is put down by Matt Damon, so it's really great scene. But he uses all this like jargon, like, my contention is that prior to the Revolutionary War, the economic modalities, especially of the southern colonies, could most aptly be characterized as agrarian pre-capitalist. So tons of jargon, like just totally being a jerk. And then Matt Damon really makes fun of him, and it's great. But that's how I kind of keep like, this really has to do with overt prestige versus covert prestige. And either can be used by a speaker, where you see Matt Damon switches back and forth pretty effortlessly between the two. And it really impacts how others perceive them, just depending on the circumstance. So prestige really indicates that how language can become a marker of your group identity, of your speech community, like who you're trying to identify with. So looking at this with social class and pronunciation, there was actually a really famous study by William Labov back in the 1960s, and he examined class and overt prestige in New York. So what he did is he went into 3 New York department stores that varied based on status. So high status was Saks, middle status was Macy's, and Klein's was low status. And he went up to a sales clerk and asked for location of objects he knew to be on the fourth floor, and then asked for clarification. So he basically tested their spontaneous speech by asking them right away. And then he tested their careful speech by making them really enunciate and repeat themselves by pretending like he didn't understand or didn't hear. And what he found was that the higher the prestige of the store, the more R sounds were produced. So higher versus lower social class was illustrated by this R. So what happened is when he asked them fourth floor, or to say where something was on the fourth floor, at the end of the middle of fourth and end of floor, they had to produce this R sound. And depending on the store, so Saks is S, M is Macy's, Klein's is K, the way in which they pronounce the R differed depending on the level of the store. So the more prestigious, the more overt pronunciation of that R. And between the middle class, when he asked for them in spontaneous speech versus careful speech to repeat themselves, they showed the greatest difference there. So this middle class here is, I think this one is spontaneous, or no, I think it's the other way, like spontaneous, oh yeah, spontaneous and careful speech versus spontaneous and careful there. So the middle class was actually the group that, they started with less pronunciation of this R, and then when they asked to repeat themselves, they said it more clearly. So from this study, they concluded that post-vocalic R is actually considered or associated with higher levels of prestige in the New York dialect. So looking further at R and prestige though, in the 1970s, Trudgill, something like that, found that working class speakers in England used more post-vocalic R than middle class. And the upper middle class speakers didn't really use R at all. So we saw that for the use of R, it was working class used more than middle class than upper class. So what this shows is that in England, post-vocalic R was actually considered less prestigious. So in both New York and England, that R sound is a social marker, but in different directions. For one, it has to do with prestige. For the other, it did not. So you can really look socially at the use of these even like very small distinctions between how much you say in R to understand how closely that speech is tied to prestige and status and class. So moving on to gender and language, there's some pretty distinct findings between how people of different genders use language. So what some researchers, a lot of Lebov's group looking at this stuff, found is that when speaking with people from the same social background, women tend to use more prestigious forms than males. And men tend to use more non-standard forms when they're around people of the same social background. So this means that women are more likely to say like ing at the end of a verb, so like doing, going, stuff like that. And men are more likely to say in, so doing, going. There's a question here. I've heard that the British accent is actually the way we speak now, an American accent, that the British started speaking mostly in RP as a status thing. Interesting. I don't know too much about the difference between British and American accents, but I know, especially when we talk about an American accent or a British accent, that's really not totally telling because it's so regionally different, and especially with British, like the stuff you hear on TV versus like if you were there, some of it's like really hard to understand. So, but yeah, thanks for sharing. And so women also tend to use a higher frequency of novel forms than men. So this has shown that women actually are generally considered innovators in linguistic change. So they find this a lot with women, and they also find this a lot with younger generations, are the ones that tend to um, kind of bring about those types of changes. So maybe like the change Marina is talking about, those tend to be driven by women and younger generations. And so, for example, women are more likely to adopt the R pronouncing norm in New York accents than men or older generations. So looking a little more at gender and language use, gender can interact with social class. So we know that there's differences between male and female patterns, particularly when we look at middle class level of speakers. So those differences, for some reason, just really seem to draw out in the middle class. I don't actually know why, but I think that's a pretty interesting area of research and pretty prolific finding that they find that it tends to be drastically different in the middle class. We also know that females tend to use more rising intonation in their speech, more tag questions. I feel like this is probably subject to some memes on the internet as well, like, you like dogs, don't you? Very leading questions. They tend to use more hedges, I think, I feel, maybe. They tend to use more indirect speech acts, especially when they're in the same gender group. And they tend to use what's known as more back channels, like, yeah, really? When they're speaking. And I think, there's a lot of reasons out there for why this happens, and I don't want to get too into them. I don't know if they might be a little polarizing, but this is largely what research is showing for the difference between male and female speech. So looking at language in ethnic background, this is actually a really cool field of study, but I'll just show you two examples with African American English and Chicano English. And there are a lot of other examples of this. And I just really want to point out with this that not all like African Americans will speak AAE, not all Chicanos people will speak Chicano English, and people who speak those dialects also don't always belong to those groups, but they identify with and end up speaking those dialects. And not all speakers of AAE will show the exact same patterns or to the same extent. This does vary. And with both Chicano English and African American English, there's actually very systematic rules. And one reason it's really important to understand this is that if, as you go into the speech and hearing field, if you're a clinician, it's really important to consider people's social dialect, their ethnic background when diagnosing. So if people are, dropping verbs, is that a product of their dialect and of their speech community? Or is that because they are unable to use those features of language? So it's really important to have this knowledge when you're going into that field. We're just gonna barely scratch the surface of it. So looking at some of the productive rules of AAE, you actually see there's a lot of, like I said, systematicity. And so with phonology, I don't know if you guys have looked at this at all with your classes, but with phonology, there's the rule where voiceless dental fricatives like th or fa are, or what is it? They become the, I have to think of my rules. Fa. Yeah, so they change word initially and word finally. So for ta, word initially and finally, we see examples like with to going to wit. And for fa, word immediately and finally, we see examples of things like birthday going to birthday. And this might like sound, stereotypical of certain types of speech, but again, this is actually like a phonological pattern in the language. Just like other languages have. You know, this is just another form of that. There's also this tendency to reduce final clusters. So when you have a final cluster on the end of a word, something like hand will become hand, list will become list, past, when you add this past tense, you end up getting this consonant cluster at the end, past. So that will become past. But in situations where you add like an ed, past tense morpheme on there, and when you do that, this vowel becomes inserted there, then you don't see that dropping, that reduction of the final cluster. So that's just to illustrate that even it might sound like an AAE, they drop these morphological markers, but it's not a matter of dropping the morphological markers. It's a matter of these phonological rules. So if it breaks one of the phonological rules, then you won't hear that morphological marker, but it's still there, like in the example of weighted. Looking at morphosyntax with AAE, I think this is what most people know about with how they produce different morphemes. So you'll see a lot of times morpheme omission, like he or she, go. You'll get things like double negation, ain't nothing you can do. And then with the verb be, there's a lot going on with the verb be. So the verb be is not always used, but again, it has very like rigid rules for how it's used. So when we look at it here, something like he workin' refers to current tense, like present tense, I guess I should say. So that's something like he is working, to show he working. Something like he be working, it has to do with like habitual behavior. So every day he works. And then he been working has to do with something that's already started or happening early. So like he has been working. And you'll see that across AAE. This is how these are used. And in every case of that interpretation, that would be how the person who uses these productive rules in their speech would do it. And again, one of the reasons just to bring this up is just so that as future potential clinicians, you really recognize that this isn't a speech disorder issue. This is a dialect, and you have to recognize that. It can get pretty tricky for clinicians to have to always like think about all these moving parts. And I just wanted to add this slide there to really drive that home, that there's a real stigmatization for AAE because those grammatical constructions in the dialect conflict with our standard dialect expectations. So some of those features of AAE have really been stigmatized as bad language. And that's definitely not the case. And that's why I kept correcting myself earlier, because it's not about bad language, it's about different language use. So several of these features that I showed you are kind of considered, like in mainstream media before this was really studied, it was considered sloppy. But we realized that these patterns, the way that they're using them, are not atypical globally. So what that means is that we actually find these types of patterns across many different languages. So languages like Russian lacks the verb to be and includes double negation. And Spanish also has double negatives. You can actually find double negatives all throughout other languages. So the way we do it in English is just one way. And when dialects vary, that's all it is a variation of that. And just to spend a quick minute on Chicano English. Chicano English follows a lot of those same patterns. So it's really influenced by Spanish. There is some influence of AAE in Chicano English. And then especially here, there's a lot of Californian English influence in there. And so it can, though, vary geographically. So it can be really influenced by like Texas English or East Coast English, depending on where that group that speaks Chicano English is. So with phonology, we see a lot of Spanish influenced sound changes. So for the sound sh, we'll often get a ch. So for shop, we'll often hear things like chop. And for things like talking, we'll often hear talking. So that vowel gets kind of elongated, whereas in standard American English, it's a little bit shorter. It's that is sound versus e sound. And there can also be influences from non-Spanish languages. So we see a lot of influences from English. We see like Z devoicing, stuff like that as well. And then there's also intonation in that. So in Chicano English, there's this tendency for uptalk, like that, like rising intonation at the end of declarative sentences. So again, these are just some features for how specific dialects vary. And it wasn't till pretty recently that both Chicano English and AAE have started to be studied really wow, I can't talk today, guys, really systematically. And so a lot of findings are coming out from that. And it's really kind of changing a lot of the stereotypes around it. Okay. So if there's no questions about that, we'll go into our last section for this class. So this last section is really about trying to understand what came first, language or thought. So some of you may or may not be familiar with this concept of linguistic determinism. So this was made famous by that Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And linguistic determinism says that language really determines the way that we think about the world. So sometimes this is referred to as strong language. And really the overarching idea behind this is that the language that we're born into determines in this like fixed and totally unalterable way the way in which we go about perceiving our world. So from this perspective, it's really language shaping our thought. So let's look at some of the evidence that was cited for under this like linguistic determinism domain. So one of the famous instances was from Gordon, 2004, of the Paraha I think they're down in Brazil, and I probably just butchered that name. But the Paraha, they actually don't have a like numerical counting system. So their system is what you call one-to-many system. So they have numbers for one, or words for one, words for two, and then many after that. So Gordon actually went down and tested whether they could numerically match the number of objects laid out in front of them across a bunch of different tasks. So with these tasks in A through D, what you see is that they were told to either match, they used batteries, so I think it was like AA batteries and Brazil nuts, and they were told to use those to match what they saw the researcher do. So on one side of the line would be the researchers' batteries or whatever, and then on the other side would be the person from the Paraha tribe. And what they found is that when, and actually for all these cases, that the Paraha only did well when the number was less than 4. So you see on all of these graphs, around 4, the percent correct really drops off. In E here, what they had to do was they actually had to use a pen and paper, which was very uncommon in their culture, to draw the number that the experimenter drew. And then in F, they would see the numerical display for around, I think it was like 1 second, and then it would be hidden and they were told to match that display. And then in this one, whoops, the experimenter would put nuts in a can while they watched, and then the experiment would remove them one by one and ask after each time they removed it, would they say, are there any nuts in the can? And you see, like for this one especially, at 2, they're already starting to go down in performance. So once they get to 3, they have a really hard time saying if there's any nuts left in the can. And then in this final one, candy was placed inside a box that had a certain number of fish drawn on the lid of the box. And then the box was hidden and it was brought out again along with another box that had a different number of fish on it. And they had to choose which box had the candy in it. So you see here, there's 5 fish, and then this box had one less. So the candy would be in this box and they would have to choose this box. And you see that they're really, not performing too well on this task. And so what they realized was that as the task demand seemed to increase, like as it involved more memory and other types of like manipulation of the objects, they started to perform a lot worse. So you start to see these like big sharp declines, whereas up here it kind of levels out and then declines. And so from this, the author suggested that because the Paraha lacks discrete number words in their language, they're unable to perform this numerical task. So looking at this for other examples across the world, Worf of Sapir-Whorf also described Hopi time language. So for this, Hopi, they don't have any words for grammatical form or anything relating to time. And so Worf from this concluded that because they don't have these expressions for time, they have no general notion or intuition of time as a smooth flowing continuum. So they don't have these ideas of future through the present and into the past. Similarly with Eskimo snow language, you guys may have heard this about how there's all these different ways to say snow in different Eskimo languages. And so they have a lot more words for snow than in English. So Worf argued that Eskimos kind of carve up the concept of snow because they perceive it in all of these varying and distinct ways from other types of snow. So in English, we only have, for the most part, especially as a Southern Californian, I pretty much just say snow. But because of that, I only perceive snow as snow. I don't have all of these distinctions in my head for different types of snow, whereas Worf argues that Eskimos do because they have all these words. So linguistic determinism has been largely criticized. So let's look at some of the problems for linguistic determinism. So the first one is that lacking the word for something doesn't necessarily mean that you can't perceive it. Oh, Marina has a comment. There's a really great book on linguistic determinism called Through the Language Glass. Nice, if anyone is interested. Yeah, that's a pretty famous book, so thanks for putting that in there. So for some of these problems are that with the Paraha, they could tell the difference between 3 objects and 4 objects perceptually. So if you put down 3 objects on a table or whatever, and then add a 4th one, perceptually they know that there's another one there, and they can see that it's another one. They just can't describe it. Or if you take things away, they have more difficulty holding it in memory. So it seems that just because they don't have the language for it doesn't mean that they can't describe it. It does still exist in their mind and in their thoughts. And when you look at that, from kind of like our Western perspective, our Californian perspective, despite having few words for snow, I can still perceive the difference between different types of snow. So if there's a type of snow that's, falling slightly to the left and there's a word for that, I can still perceive that. I just don't have a different word to describe that. I would just maybe use many words or just say there's snow. So that's one problem. Another problem is that if strict linguistic determinism were true, language change would pretty much be impossible. But we know that we discover and have new ideas, we make new words for things. So words like Google, if linguistic determinism were true, then we would have had to think of the word Google and then come up with the product Google. But it doesn't really work that way. So kind of a problem for linguistic determinism. And we know that we can have ideas and feelings and different thoughts that we just don't have the words to describe. And a good example of these are words that are not translatable from one language to the next. So one of those is Schadenfreude, so pleasure derived from another person's misfortune. If I want to talk about that feeling, it's kind of hard for me to capture it with just one word. I really have to try to talk around it to capture that feeling. From Spanish, we have, I'll probably butcher this, sobremesa, the moment after eating a meal when the food is gone, but the conversation is still flowing at the table. There's yugen from Japanese, which has to do, which I found this amazing, has to do with a profound, mysterious sense of the beauty of the universe and the sad beauty of human suffering. And then there's a word from Portuguese, which Carrie can probably say a lot better than I can, but saudade, which is melancholic longing or nostalgia for a person, place, or thing that is far away from you. So what we can see is that basically language doesn't necessarily seem to be shaping our thoughts. I can perceive things, I can feel things, I can have ideas for things that I don't have words for. So let's look at linguistic relativity. So linguistic relativity is a theory that language influences the way we think about the world. So sometimes this is referred to as a weak form of linguistic determinism. And basically what it's saying is that cultural factors and other experiences may override that deterministic nature of our languages. So we can, language really helps us shape thought, but other factors can come into play with that, is what linguistic relativity is saying. So there's this researcher, she's actually at UCSD, she does really cool work in the field of linguistic relativity, Lara Boroditsky, and she did this study where she had participants who were either Spanish speakers or German speakers describe different items. And half of the items were masculine in one language and feminine in the other language. So they would be like, in German, it would be a masculine word, and in Spanish, that word would be a feminine word. And what they found is that for a word key, which is a masculine word in German, der Schlüssel, and as a feminine word in Spanish, la clave, Germans would describe keys as like these hard, heavy, jagged objects, but Spanish speakers would describe them as golden and intricate and little and lovely. And similarly, they found the reverse. Bridge in German is feminine, die Brücke, and in German or in Spanish, bridge is masculine. It's, I think, el puente. And so for bridge, Spanish speakers described it as big and dangerous and long and sturdy, strong, but German speakers described it as beautiful and elegant and fragile. So the researchers really took this as your perception and your experience in the world influencing your language, and vice versa, your language really influencing your perception. So it's that interaction between the two. They also, I think it was, I don't think I put who studied this, but there was also a study looking at agentivity and memory. So in English, English uses agentive constructions even for accidental events. So we always have an agent that does something in English. So that would be like John broke the vase. And in Spanish, they don't always use that construction. So In Spanish, they would say something like, the vase broke itself. And what these researchers found is that English and Spanish speakers differed in their description of a memory for accidental events. So when we look at description of accidental events here, English speakers, for the most part, would still use that agentive construction, whereas Spanish speakers really didn't. And then when they described them in memory, again, you see those differences. So it just seems like because of those constructions in language, that really influences how you describe and remember certain events, whether they were accidents or not accidents. Okay. So finally, whoops, that's not supposed to be showing up. Looking at linguistic relativity with color perception, there are a lot of really cool studies that actually look at color perception across speakers of different languages. But again, Borodetsky's group looked at color perception in Russian because Russian has this distinction between darker and lighter shades of blue. So for lighter shades of blue, they have one word, and for darker shades of blue, they have another word. And what they did was they asked participants to indicate which square matched the top square. So they would see this top square come up, and then they would see these other squares here come up. So Goluboy is, I think that's for, I don't remember which one, but Goluboy represents either lighter or darker blue, and Cine represents, it looks kind of here like darker blue. And then they did this where in some cases all would be either light blue blocks, so all of these are light blue, or in other cases just one square here would differ. And what they found was that Russians were a lot slower to match the squares in this within condition compared to in the cross condition. So that's what you see here. They're performing, this is their reaction time, and they're performing a lot slower in this condition. And the reason they gave is that because the distinction between light and dark was no longer there for them in this within category, so it actually slowed them down because then they really couldn't rely on that clear boundary to distinguish and had to really focus in perceptually on what those differences were. Whereas in English, we just kind of group things as blue and we don't have distinct boundaries in our language. And so for us, for English speakers, I wasn't in the study, for English speakers, they were able to just perform that a lot faster, whether it was the cross or within condition. And so they said again from this that your experience with language really influences your perception. The last thing we'll look at with linguistic relativity is studies that have looked at facial recognition. So Dr. Karen Emery in our department is actually pretty well known for doing some facial recognition studies, looking at this concept of linguistic relativity. And what they did was using what's known as the Benton test of facial recognition. Participants are asked to pick out the face that matches the face or faces that match the image at the top. So you would see this image at the top pop up and you would say, which one image matches the top one? And through here, you'd have to go and pick it out. For this one, do you guys know here which image matches the top one? Do you think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or 6? I can count. What do you guys think? It's kind of hard to do. I know it's actually kind of blurry on here. This is an old article. Yeah, it's hard to tell, huh? Someone says 4, I think 4, 5, question mark? Yeah. Yeah, so I think this one is actually number 5. That's like pretty hard to do, right? Yeah, more of you guys are starting to say 5. So what about this one? Which of the 3 faces matches this top one? So in here, 3 of them match. What do you guys think? You can just say one of them if you think one of them matches for sure. 5 and 2, 2, 5, one of them. Nice. Yeah. So this is a pretty hard task to do, and barring the fact that the image quality isn't great, it's a hard task. So for this one, it's actually 2, 5, and 6 that match. And what Emery and other researchers have found is that signing children and adults are a lot faster and a lot more accurate at this task than non-signers are. And oh, here's your correct answers for you guys. You can go test other people. And the reason why they said is because sign language uses facial expressions to convey certain aspects of meaning. So, because of that experience, having to attend to these uh, fine distinctions in facial expression, signers end up being more sensitive to these slight differences in these pictures and are better able to pick out the correct faces than non-signers. So to summarize up linguistic determinism and relativity, kind of where it stands, is that it seems that language doesn't really change your perception of the world. So it won't change your ability to recognize numbers, to recognize time, to distinguish colors. But what it can do is it can make certain tasks easier. So language may motivate you to pay attention to and attend to like certain perceptual features of the world, and it gives you more practice with distinguishing those features. So in the case of sign language, they have a lot more practice having to do things like distinguishing facial features. So they seem to be better at doing that. So the overall idea was that linguistic determinism was really too strong of an idea. It's not that it's totally wrong. It's just kind of too strong in saying that language determines everything. And it seems that linguistic relativity is really more accurate, and that language is really influenced by life experience and vice versa. So there's a little more interaction there than what linguistic determinism allowed for. So that is all I have for you guys today for once I'm ending early. Are there any other questions here about the lecture or about things moving forward with the course? Carrie and I will be in office hours later too, and we can set up some private. We'll put the waiting room feature on, so if you guys want to talk about grades or anything like that, we can definitely do that. And you guys are welcome. Juliana asked, so we still have lecture next week, right? Yes, we have one more next week. That one, I think we're going to do it on writing. I still haven't totally decided. Your assigned reading is on writing. But yeah, we'll have one more next week, and it will be included on exam 5 if you're going to take it. And then that Thursday, you guys don't have any class. You can just talk to us if you want to schedule an appointment or something, but no class. No problem. Okay, if there's no other questions, then I'm gonna log off and we'll be over in office hours around 3:30 if you have other questions. Bye guys.